On to our final panel. We're going to have a look at how privacy relates to CTV, in particular solutions for GDPR and post third-party cookies. To lead us through this panel, we have Ninon Vagner, Privacy and Compliance Manager for IAB Europe, who's going to take us through this conversation that many of us want to pay really close attention to at the moment. And there are some really challenging topics here that I'm hoping, Ninon, you and your fellow panelists will help us at least work towards a solution there. So I'm going to hand over to you now, Ninon, if you're there.
Yeah, thank you, David. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I hope everyone can hear me well. So this last panel will focus on how data protection laws impact connected TV environments, discuss the solutions and challenges for achieving compliance with GDPR and the e-privacy directive. And finally, we'll look at how addressability and CTV can be affected when privacy principles are leveraged in the same manner as browsers do with third-party cookies for web-based services. So to do this, I am very pleased to introduce our experts to talk about those very interesting topics. So we have Aruna Sharma, Group VP, Lead Counsel Global Privacy and Tech and DPO at Xandr. Alex Cohn, Senior Director, Product Management at IAB TechLab. James Prudhomme, Executive VP International at Index Exchange, and finally Zachary Faruque, Marketing Solutions Engineer at OneTrust. I know this is very early for some of you, so thank you so much for joining us. If you have any questions during the discussion, don't hesitate to enter them in the question box, and we will run through them at the end of the panel. So the first point that comes to mind when comparing CTV with web-based or mobile services is the fact that smart TVs or related devices manufacturers use many different operating systems, such as Android, Tizen, Roku, etc. So Zachary, what are the technical challenges for a CTV app builder or its provider to implement a consent management solution on CTV and leverage IAB transparency and consent framework?
Hi everyone, thanks Ninon. Yeah, as Ninon said, Zachary, Solution Engineer here at OneTrust, works specifically with publishers on implementing CMP capabilities across web, mobile, and CTV OTT. Thank you for having me today. I think you mentioned it in the question. One of the biggest challenges that we see is the tech lift that's required in order to implement privacy solutions in the CTV space. And that's because it's quite a fragmented marketplace at the moment. Sometimes, unfortunately, actually competition prevents competition in other areas because it increases the barrier to entry. So unlike the web, where you can create a JavaScript SDK and that is just going to work across all of the different browsers, albeit with some nuances, you don't have that capability within the CTV space. So you look at, Samsung that runs Tizen OS, LG that runs WebOS. You've got Fire Stick. There are so many iOS tvOS. So there are so many different operating systems that you actually have to build out your CMP in every one of those operating systems in order for it to be surfaced in the different TVs that your consumers may be purchasing. On top of that, one of the big challenges is when we start thinking about the user experience where, maybe they've got a Samsung TV downstairs, but they've got an LG TV upstairs. They still want to consume your content across those two different TVs, but what you're going to be asking them to do is consent downstairs and then go upstairs and reconsent again upstairs if you're not able to handle cross-device or cross-environment consents. So I think that's also one of the key pieces that's imperative from a CTV perspective when we start thinking about privacy and keeping the customer's experience a big part of just the regulatory consent that we may be trying to capture.
Thanks, Zach. And with regards to interoperability between the publishers and an ad tech partner like index exchange with regards to user choice. What could and should be further improved in this environment, James?
Well, I think in the CTV environment, things like the TCF have yet to really address the nuances of it. And so I apologize that I missed a lot of what Alex said because I've been having some connectivity issues. So I'm just starting the call a little bit late. But I think that is that very are likely to, engage with a new kind of data and privacy terms and conditions and those sorts of things exclusively within the CTV environment. So in other words, they're likely to sign up for services over a web browser or using their mobile device. They're likely to consent to the privacy terms and conditions using those other devices. And then in most cases, they're most likely to simply, log in once in the CTV environment and then have an authenticated experience all the way through that. So I think that, from an ad tech perspective, the notion of identifying users through these consented identifiers or consented mechanisms, and then, being able to, how do I put it? Being able to kind of work that back, if you will, to the consent they've provided on other devices will be key.
Thanks, James. The browsing experience is also much different on a TV set than on desktop or smartphones, notably because of the remote. So Aruna, how to achieve the level of transparency and offer users the granularity of choices required by GDPR across devices?
Yeah, sure. So I think that standardization has come up before in different contexts, and I think that's also here should be one of the guiding principles. If we look at this from the legal perspective and at the GDPR requirements with regard to notice and consent, with regard to the CTV environment, we have to look at the founding principles, which are, for example, general accessibility. So notices and consent need to be easily accessible. And then there needs to be transparency. That is one of the other guiding principles in that space. And how do we create that? And in my opinion, given that there are so many different devices and so many different technologies that consumers are confronted with, the path forward is really to have a standardization of notices and consents across the industry that goes across specific technologies. Because the more of these disclosures consumers are seeing with different ways of how they can consent and where they can find it, I don't know how many people have looked at various notices on CTV. It is very complex, very hard to understand, and really not helpful in the interest of consumer privacy, which I think should be a guiding principle for everything that we do in this space. And so I think the transparency and consent framework, especially TCF 2.0, is actually a really good example where we are seeing a standardization of consent notices. They're not all the same, but at least if you're a consumer and you're coming to a website, you're more likely to see the same type of disclosure and the same type of mechanism. And I think it would be in the interest of everybody to establish something that works across, with, of course, being aware of all the technical challenges.
Yeah, thanks, Aruna. Indeed, standardization across devices would really ease the user's understanding on what are the specific purposes of our industry. In terms of the practical approaches adopted on those devices, Zachary, what have you seen in terms of UIs and user journeys to maintain the ease of navigation on TV set?
Yeah, I mean, firstly, I totally agree with Aruna there in regards to standardization. I think it makes it much more much easier for consumers to understand what it is they're being presented with, rather than it being different everywhere that you go across different devices. I think one of the challenges, specifically with regards to the TCF and the CTV space, and it was mentioned earlier that you have a remote, you don't have a mouse. And specifically the TCF, we've got a lot of purposes, features, special features, all of that needs to be able to, fit neatly on the screen. And while we have big screen sizes, what becomes harder is navigating through those with a remote rather than a mouse. We've spoken to partners and prospects, and they've been talking about experiences where potentially you move to another device in order to do the consent piece and to address TCF, because the ad tech ecosystem are crying out for TCF and CTV, so they're putting pressure on the publishers to start passing TC strings. But the TCF itself as a policy and framework doesn't cover the CTV space, and that goes back to the technical issue in regards to, how do you standardize the integration? We have the JavaScript API in the web for passing on consent, but within the CTV space, that's not standardized, and we're looking at more than just Android and mobile in mobile apps. So from a UI perspective, it is possible to get it on the screen. It's just how do you make that nice and easy, and when do you present it to a user as well? Is it like what we see on websites, where the first thing you will get is a banner right in your face before you even decided to trust the brand or want to work with the brand, because you can't see any of the content because there's this big banner in your face because they want to sell you ads? When do you present that to a user in the CTV space? Do we need to start thinking about that experience a bit more and say, well, actually, it's fine. We'll give you contextual ads so that you can get to know us and we can get to know you. And then beyond that, we'll start asking you specifically for consent so that we can start looking at doing things like personalization. But certainly, I think you can fit it in the UI, but there are lots of workarounds that we're seeing talked about in the marketplace at the moment that certainly don't breed the best customer experiences.
Thanks, Zach. Thanks a lot for those answers. I think we'll move now to the second part of today's discussion. There is much talk on the demise of third-party cookies by browsers and Apple's change to IDFA. Alex, who takes the role of the end-user agent in CTV environments, and is there a threat that they would follow the same movement when it comes to data sharing?
Yeah, I mean, you think about, first, the direct answer to the question of who takes the role. I think there's still the same question that there is in web and mobile, in the sense that, there's a lot of people with claim to be, the first party, I guess, or the user agent. There's the TV manufacturer that makes the hardware. They potentially could have a claim. There's the operating system, if that's different than the TV manufacturer. Then there's the app itself. And we've seen interesting news articles in even recent time of companies kind of battling one another for that control, I guess, to get access to user level data. So I think the jury's still out on who acts as the user agent. To get to kind of Zach's point, the user experience around control of any sort of data collection or data uses is going to be a different experience altogether. I think there's different user experience claims that you could make there. One could say, well, you should just do it when you set up the TV, and therefore it's probably the TV operating system that is the user agent, and then kind of takes control in the same way that potentially like iOS has taken sort of steps with iOS 14, and they're sort of shutting off an identifier if you don't get consent to their specific pop-up. I think though there's an interesting case at the app level, though, and thinking about what Zach was just saying of, waiting a little while to potentially show like personalized ads. I was thinking about, well, you still need an identifier actually to do frequency capping. And one of the worst experiences in TV is getting the same ad again and again. And my kids even say like, why do they keep showing us this ad? Aren't they having to pay for that? Like, yeah. So potentially that could be, there could be an argument on the user experience side, at least, that, having control at the level of the actual app that you're watching TV through. So if that's, HBO Max, or if that's, whatever it is, Netflix, who doesn't show ads right now, Hulu, that could be a user experience argument there. But I think we will, because of Android's ubiquity, and not just on mobile devices, but also on TVs, we may see, large platforms taking sort of like a perspective that they should be in control. And hopefully, though, in that case, like with Google joining TCF, potentially we'll see, a platform like Google, who does have a lot of share in operating system sort of UI, adopting standard approaches to transparency and control. But that's a hope right now. We don't know what the movement will be there.
Thanks. Yeah, to follow up on what you were saying, Aruna, what would be the possible way forward for the industry to ensure convergence towards more interoperability between all of the different players in the CTV ecosystem?
Yeah, so of course, totally agree with Alex, and think that in this space, I mean, the question becomes, I think what we talked about before, notice, consent is kind of like a micro issue, but the macro issue is how do we ensure that there's industry participation in developing processes that work across? And you're mentioning convergence, right? That we have a process that is just standardized. And how do we ensure that in this window of opportunity, I think that we currently have, before large platforms just create facts and determine the process? And I think it would be really in the interest of consumer privacy and transparency, and of the content providers, finally, that there's wider participation and determination of how should things look like, how should we do all this. Of course, the technical details, I defer to the other experts we have here on the panel, but think that efforts like TCF 2.0 have been setting up great examples. Xandr has been very supportive of TCF 2.0, and of course we have to go beyond that. But I think overall, independently of what technology we are talking about, we have to resolve this issue. And that's usually done best if all the players come together and work on an overarching program. And Alex, I'm sure I can talk more about a lot of other efforts that are out there. But yeah, so I think that is probably the most promising way forward on this issue.
Thank you. Also it seems that CTV publishers have larger logged-in audiences than traditional media. So does it make them and their tech player partners better armed to deal with addressability issues? James, what are your views on the possible limitation to access CTV device identifiers?
Well, I think you're right that CTV publishers or OTT publishers with CTV apps certainly do have an advantage over traditional media publishers today in with regards to the reach that they have in terms of logged in environments. Alex was absolutely correct when he sort of highlighted the kind of complexity, and I would even call it the sort of nested complexity of the ecosystem. So between TV manufacturers and operating system providers, and then you have apps that run ecosystems of apps. So if you take something like Plex, for example, which a lot of people use, Plex has its own app ecosystem, running within its own environment that runs on Android. So that just the layers of complexity are just confounding in some cases. So if you look at the announcement, I think it just came out yesterday from ITV in the UK. I think that's a good example of what publishers and broadcasters will try to do. they're effectively sort of creating their own walled garden. So they have their own environment, users are logged in, they're offering their own ad technology solutions for advertisers to target those people. And then I guess in some ways trying to circumvent either the TV manufacturer or the operating system provider, and just trying to create a closed ecosystem. And I think we've seen other examples of that with broadcasters across Europe as well. I think it's a smart idea. I think time will tell if it's a successful idea or not. I think, you know, Aruna's points are all really well taken in terms of the industry, you know, coming together and trying to work together and collaborate. However, I think the allure and the draw of creating your own walled garden, I think, are just going to be too strong at this point. And I think a lot of different players, broadcasters, TV manufacturers, you know, Samsung just announced the release of their own DSP, operating system providers, you name it. Everyone's going to try to make a play for having their own closed ecosystem and their own closed environment. I think if you let that play itself out over a few years, a lot of these people might realize, hey, we are better off collaborating and creating a more open ecosystem. But I just don't think that will be the norm in the early days. I think it will take the industry a few years to get there.
Thanks. And Alex, do you think this alternative to device identifier relying on logged-in environment may have limitations as well?
I mean, at the end of the day, to get back to kind of Aruna's point around principles, like the principles of the regulations that are governing data protection and privacy right now wouldn't necessarily make a distinction between, you know, I'm not a lawyer, but what I, in my mind, as a product person too, like those principles of like, you know what, whether the user's identified by an IFA or whether they're identified by being logged in, they're being identified. So yeah, I think interestingly, you know, you see, however, at least in other ecosystems, for instance, in Apple's ecosystem, they've got the sign in with Apple that's actually, you know, in a way could take over the ability of sort of publisher closed authenticated ecosystems to be able to identify users, because the sign in with like Apple sort of obfuscates their sign in to only Apple knowing who that user is. So like the same thing could happen in TV. I don't know. I think that's going to be a very debated space. But you know, another point that I think has been made here is that there is an opportunity right now in TV where there's, you know, there are a lot of people making walled plays, to James' point, but there's not as much like prominence of any one singular player. So there is an opportunity if we were to act proactively a bit on standardizing things and making things more predictable, that we could maybe preempt some of those moves that sort of turn CTV into the cat and mouse game that browsers have been, and now that it seems like mobile operating systems are becoming.
Thanks. Yeah, so from what you're saying, the way users are identified, if this is through an ID or HTML, doesn't really matter in the eyes of the regulator, which is true, but the bigger threat right now would be that privacy can be leveraged for competitive advantages. Yeah, and if but because the ecosystem is more fragmenting than for web or mobile services, there is more room to work on interoperability when it comes to users' transparency and control over their data. Maybe Aruna, you want to add something on this? I can't hear you.
Oh, I'm sorry. I agree with Alex, agree with James. Of course, I mean, there is the incentive for platform providers and others who have the ability to build walled gardens to do that. But I think overall, longer term, it is really, Alex, to your point, yes, absolutely correct. The requirements are technology neutral. You have to provide notice, and there's no prescriptive requirement of how this has to be displayed, which leads to a lot of uncertainty, of course, but which also clarifies that there should be a way, or that could be a proactive project for the industry to develop something that works. Because if you're operating within your own environment without input by anybody else, you can also, of course, take the wrong turn or establish procedures that may actually not work out or may be criticized by regulators. So I understand that the incentives are there, but I would say it is still very much a longer term, the longer term project goal should be that everyone works together, because this is an industry where there's a lot of data flows, exchange of data, and yeah, so I still think that would be the right approach. Understanding all the challenges and difficulties. Don't want to make it sound easier than it is.
Thanks. We have a few questions from the audience. The first one is about excluding HBB-TV technology from the field of CTV. When it comes down to privacy in the HBB-TV technology, the broadcasting network operator, like Archiva or Cellnex, is guarding the technology and thus provides arguably first-party data. Not sure who in the audience wants to take this. Who in the panel wants to take this question? Okay.
I'm not sure if I understand the question exactly.
No, me neither. Second question is, I think, for Zachary. It's about TCF 2.0 on TTV. Are there any CMPs which are able to deal with the TCF on CTV?
Yes, of course there are. OneTrust CMP is ready to go in CTV and OTT space, and there are other providers out there. It is definitely something that I would advise you to look at if there are any publishers watching, because while a lot of the talk today has been on what can we do to standardize, the reality is there is a regulatory requirement today that CTV does fall under, and that you should be looking to address. I think I'm quite interested to watch, what happens with the paywall in Germany. It's been driven out of Germany, but TCF has now introduced derogations based on this, which effectively allows, a switching or a choice to the user between AVOD and SVOD within the CTV space. So I think that's something to certainly watch out for from a UI perspective as well within CTV for TCF.
Thanks. So we have run out of time, but I would like to thank you all for your participation today. I'm sure it was helpful for the people who joined. I now hand over to David.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.